Small gardens have one obvious limitation. You run out of ground faster than you think. A couple of sprawling squash vines, a row of cucumbers, or a few vigorous climbers can fill the space between your beds surprisingly quickly. But there's one part of the garden that many of us barely count as growing space at all: the fence. A fence may take up only a few inches of ground at its base, but above that is an entire vertical surface, sometimes stretching dozens of feet around a yard. With the right plants, that space can produce peas, cucumbers, squash, grapes, and plenty of other food without adding another garden bed. The important thing is that not every climbing plant belongs on every fence. Some vines are light and grab onto supports almost by themselves. Others need extra netting or a little training. Some carry heavy fruit that needs support. And a few become so vigorous that a weak fence simply isn't enough to hold them. So in this video, we're going from cool season vines that barely put any strain on a fence to plants that can turn an entire section of it into a wall of food. And the plant at number 1 may be the easiest place to start if you just want to turn one unused stretch of fence into productive garden space next season. Number 9. Sugar snap peas. Most people think of fences and trellises as something that becomes useful once summer vines start growing. But your fence can start producing food much earlier than that. Sugar snap peas are cool season plants. They do their best during the cooler weeks of spring, when many summer vegetables still aren't ready to go into the ground. For this kind of vertical garden, choose one of the taller vining varieties rather than a compact bush type. Those vines send out small tendrils that naturally grab onto netting, wire, twine, or anything similar that gives them something to climb. If you already have a chain link fence, the support is basically built in. If you have a solid wooden fence, you can add a simple layer of garden netting or run a few horizontal and vertical strings in front of it. It doesn't have to be complicated. What makes peas especially useful here isn't just the edible pods, it's the timing. While tomatoes, cucumbers, melons, and warm season beans are still waiting for warmer soil, peas can already be using that vertical space. Then, when hotter weather arrives and pea production begins to decline, you can clear the vines and give the same fence to a summer crop. That means one narrow strip of ground can support two very different harvests in the same year. In a small garden, that's one of the simplest ways to stop thinking only in terms of square feet and start thinking about both height and time. Number 8. Bitter melon. Once the weather warms up, a very different vine can take over that space: bitter melon. If you've ever seen bitter melon growing vigorously in midsummer, it's easy to understand why it works so well on a fence. The vines grow quickly, produce plenty of tendrils, and constantly look for something nearby to grab. The fruit is also almost impossible to confuse with anything else in the garden. Its deeply textured surface, elongated shape, and bright green color make bitter melon one of the most visually distinctive food crops you can grow vertically. This is a heat-loving plant that performs best with plenty of sun. In the right climate, the vines can create a surprisingly dense wall of foliage. That's why a little training early on can make a big difference. Instead of letting every vine twist into the same tangled mass, spread the growth across the available support. Better spacing makes it easier for light and air to move through the plant, and it also makes the fruit much easier to see and harvest. Bitter melon is normally picked while the fruit is still green and immature. Leave it too long, and the fruit begins to change color, soften, and eventually split open as it fully ripens. This crop certainly isn't for everyone. The bitter flavor is very distinctive, and in places with short summers, the vines may not have enough warm weather to reach the size and productivity you would see in hotter climates. But if you live somewhere with a good warm season and bitter melon is something your family actually eats, a sunny fence can be an extremely efficient place to grow it. Number 7. Delicata squash. Some plants benefit from a fence not because climbing is their only option, but because letting them stay on the ground can take up an enormous amount of space. Delicata squash is a great example. It's a winter squash with relatively small fruit, usually cream-colored with distinctive green or orange stripes running from end to end. and that smaller fruit size makes it much better suited to vertical growing than the giant squash varieties that can put a tremendous amount of weight on a support. A squash vine left on the ground can quickly run across a pathway, move into neighboring beds, or occupy open soil that could have been used for something else. Train that same vine upward, and most of that growth moves into vertical space instead. The plant isn't actually becoming smaller. It still produces a lot of leaves and stems. You're simply moving that growth somewhere it competes less with everything growing at ground level. But this is where the strength of your fence matters. A mature squash vine covered in leaves and carrying several fruits is much heavier than a few pea vines. A weak fence, lightweight netting, or an old structure that is already leaning isn't the right place for it. Delicata works well specifically because the fruit stays relatively manageable, and that's an important distinction. I wouldn't take this advice and automatically put every winter squash variety on a fence. Once the fruit becomes very large, the weight changes the entire equation. If you want to move a sprawling squash upward without building a massive support structure, smaller fruited varieties are the smartest place to start. Number 6. Loofah. If delicata squash helps move a space-hungry plant off the ground, loofah takes that idea to another level. This is a warm season vine that can become extremely vigorous when it gets plenty of sun, heat, and enough time to grow. A healthy loofah plant can cover a large amount of space, so a small, fragile fence is not the place for it. You need something capable of carrying the combined weight of the vines, leaves, and long fruits hanging from the plant. What makes loofah especially interesting is that the same crop can be used in two completely different ways. Very young fruits can be harvested and eaten while the inside is still tender, but leave them on the vine and the internal structure gradually changes. Once the fruit becomes fully mature and dries, the outer skin can be removed to reveal the fibrous network inside, the natural loofah sponge most people are familiar with. So the same fence can produce a vegetable early in the process and a useful household material at the end of it. There is one major catch, especially for gardeners in colder parts of the country. Growing young edible loofah and producing a fully mature, dry sponge are two very different goals. To make a good sponge, the fruit needs a long stretch of warm weather to mature completely. In areas where frost arrives early, you can grow a beautiful vine and still end up racing the calendar at the end of the season. So don't choose loofah only because those dried sponges look interesting. First, ask whether your growing season is long enough for the result you actually want. If it is, a strong, sunny fence is one of the best places to give this vine the room it needs. Number 5. Cantaloupe. Cantaloupe creates a completely different vertical gardening problem. The vine can be trained onto a fence. The leaves and tendrils are perfectly capable of growing upward, but eventually you end up with something fairly heavy hanging several feet above the ground, a melon. When cantaloupe grows along the soil, the ground carries that weight. Once you train the vine vertically, the plant has to support much more of it on its own. The solution is surprisingly simple. Give the fruit a sling. A piece of old fabric, soft netting, or another breathable material can be attached to the fence beneath the developing melon. As the fruit grows, the sling carries most of the weight instead of asking the stem to do all the work. It's a small detail, but it illustrates one of the most important rules of vertical gardening. You can't just move a plant upward and forget about how it grows. You also have to think about what that vine will eventually be carrying. For a fence garden, smaller fruited melon varieties are usually easier to manage. The stronger the fence, the more flexibility you have, but there's no reason to turn a simple vertical garden into a structural experiment. Cantaloupes also need plenty of sun and warm weather. In a small, sunny yard, moving those vines upward can free a surprising amount of ground underneath. That space can then be used for herbs, smaller leafy vegetables, or other plants that have no ability to climb for themselves. And a melon hanging safely in its own little fabric sling may be one of the more unusual sights you can create on an edible fence. Number 4. Chayote. Up to this point, most of these vines can still be kept reasonably contained with regular training. Chayote is different. In a warm climate with a long growing season, this plant can become extremely vigorous. Left to grow wherever it wants, a single vine can cover a remarkable amount of space. That makes a fence incredibly useful for chayote. It's also exactly why you shouldn't plant one beside a lightweight structure and simply hope for the best. Chayote needs somewhere to go. A long fence, a tall trellis, or another sturdy structure gives the vine a way to spread upward instead of taking over the ground below. Once established, the foliage can become dense enough to form something close to a living green wall. The fruit is the part most people recognize, but tender young shoots are also eaten in many cuisines, so the plant can provide food even beyond the familiar chayote fruit. But this is definitely not a crop I would recommend the same way everywhere in the United States. Chayote prefers warmth and a long growing season. Gardeners in colder areas have to treat it very differently from gardeners in warmer regions where the plant can survive for years and return from established roots. And before you plant one, take a serious look at the fence. If it's decorative, old, lightweight, or simply something you don't want disappearing beneath a huge mass of foliage, choose a smaller vine. With chayote, the question sometimes isn't whether the plant can climb your fence, it's whether your fence can handle the plant. Number 3. Grapes. Grapes completely change the way we think about an edible fence. Peas, cucumbers, squash, and most of the other plants in this list are started again each season. A grapevine, properly trained and cared for, can become a permanent part of the garden. A sturdy fence in a sunny location can provide the structure for training grapevines, but grapes are not something you simply plant and allow to cover everything in sight. If your only goal is producing leaves, unrestricted growth might look impressive, but the goal here is fruit. And if you want good fruit production instead of nothing but a wall of foliage, pruning and training become essential parts of growing grapes. That's also why I wouldn't describe grapes as a truly low-maintenance option. A mature, grape-covered fence can look effortless, but behind it are usually years of selecting permanent structure, directing new growth, removing unwanted canes, and keeping the vine within a space that can actually be managed. Variety selection matters too. A grape that performs beautifully in one warm region may be a poor choice somewhere with much colder winters. With a perennial crop, choosing the right variety from the beginning matters much more than it does with an annual you can simply replace next season. But if you have a sunny stretch of fence that you know will remain in place for years, grapes offer something most of the other plants on this list cannot. They can turn that vertical surface into a long-term productive part of your garden.
Number 2. Cucumbers.
If grapes are a long-term investment, cucumbers are almost the opposite. They're fast, familiar, and one of the easiest examples of why vertical growing makes sense. A vining cucumber plant can travel a surprising distance across the ground, and in a small bed, that's valuable real estate. But most of that growth doesn't need to go sideways. Plant a vining cucumber beside a suitable fence or trellis and guide the young stems upward. The tendrils gradually take over, gripping the support and holding most of the leaves and fruit above the soil. That doesn't just give you more room. Fruit hanging freely is often easier to spot at harvest time, less likely to disappear beneath leaves at ground level, and can grow straighter than fruit resting against the soil. One thing to check when buying seed is the growth habit. Not every cucumber variety is designed to make long vines. If the goal is to cover a fence, choose a vining variety rather than a compact bush cucumber bred mainly for containers or very tight spaces. And don't let the fact that the plant is growing upward make you forget about water. Cucumbers grow quickly, produce a lot of foliage, and their fruit contains a tremendous amount of water. Vertical growing does not turn them into drought-tolerant plants. Mulch around the base and relatively consistent soil moisture can still make a big difference during hot weather. If you already have a fence beside your vegetable beds and you've never tried putting cucumbers on it, this may be one of the fastest ways to see just how valuable vertical space can be. But there's still one crop that makes the idea even simpler. Number 1. Pole beans. If I had to choose just one crop to test the idea of turning a fence into productive growing space, I would start with pole beans. Not because they're the most unusual plant on this list. Not because they produce the biggest harvest by weight. And certainly not because they create something as dramatic as a melon hanging in a sling. They're number one because almost everything about the plant naturally works with vertical growing. The vines are relatively light. The pods are light. They don't need a massive structure like chayote or loofah. You don't have to wait years like you do with grapes. And you don't have to support individual fruits like you might with melons. If your fence already has mesh, or if you add a simple layer of netting or twine, pole beans have somewhere to go. The important thing is choosing pole beans rather than bush beans. Pole beans are built to keep climbing when they have support. And when the pods are harvested regularly, many varieties continue flowering and producing for an extended period. Growing them on a fence also makes harvesting remarkably convenient. Instead of bending down and searching through foliage close to the ground, many of the pods hang at a height where they're much easier to see. And the ground beneath the fence is still available. That is really what this entire video is about. We didn't create more land. We didn't make the yard bigger. We didn't build another garden bed. We simply started using a direction that had mostly been ignored. One section of fence probably isn't going to feed a family by itself, but if it gives you another row of beans, several cucumber vines, or a perennial crop you once thought you had no room to grow, then that fence is doing far more than just marking the edge of your yard.
When garden space is limited, the first instinct is usually to squeeze more plants into whatever open ground remains.
But sometimes the better solution isn't planting closer together. It's changing the direction the plants grow. Peas can use the fence during cool weather. Pole beans and cucumbers can take over when summer arrives. Squash and melons can move vines off the ground that would otherwise occupy valuable bed space. Loofah and chayote can make use of much larger structures. And if you want something more permanent, grapes can turn a fence into a productive part of the garden for years. But the best plant is still the one that fits your particular fence. A lightweight fence needs a lightweight vine. A strong structure can handle something more vigorous. And a shady fence will never perform the same way as one that gets good sun for most of the day. If you're already growing something edible on a fence, tell us in the comments what's working best for you and what part of the country you're gardening in. Experiences from different climates can help other gardeners figure out what makes sense in their own yards. If you enjoy practical gardening ideas like this, choosing plants around the space, climate, and conditions you actually have, subscribe to the channel. There are still a lot of overlooked corners in a garden that can be put to better use. A fence may mark where one part of your garden ends, but with the right plant, it can also be where another garden begins. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next garden.